Thank you for joining us, Heather.
Oh, Mr. Braswell, it's such an honor being with you. Thank you.
You know, I first heard you on the Conversations with Mark Boylan in an interview entitled Failure of Fatherhood on their First Takes podcast. And when I went to the website to listen to the podcast, I was struck by a line in their introduction for you, which said, America's high out-of-wedlock birth rate is at the heart of inner-city violence. Walk me through a little bit on your thoughts with respect to that statement.
Well, Mr. Braswell, the young kids who were involved in these just insane drive-by shootings are almost without exception the products of single-parent homes. You can go to the nation's prisons, and the people incarcerated there are overwhelmingly the product of single-parent homes. Now, as both of us know, there are many heroic single mothers who are trying to raise law-abiding, self-disciplined males and are succeeding against the odds. But the odds are very much against them. If there's one thing that social science research is almost unequivocal about, it's that growing up without a father in the home puts that child at greater risk, much, much greater risk, for a host of social pathologies, the least of which, in my view, is poverty, but certainly it puts that child at risk for poverty. But more importantly, it puts the child at risk for failing in school, dropping out, truancy, and getting involved in crime. And you can talk to some of these young juvenile delinquents themselves, and they are aware, as I discuss in my book, of the fact that not having had a parent is a real problem. And so unless we confront this overwhelming reality, I think we're going to continue to experience the fallout of children who have not had a male role model, who have not learned how to control their impulses, defer gratification, not react with violence if they feel that they're disrespected. So I think that the breakdown of the family, particularly in the inner city, is simply a social catastrophe.
You know, we've been doing this work now in Fathers Incorporated for 14 years, and we've been able to see it from a bird's eye view, professionally and personally. I myself did not see my father or meet my father until I was 23 years old in Brooklyn, New York. So that individual that you described is me, and it is the countless individuals that we come in contact with, not only here in the city of Atlanta, but around the country and, in fact, around the world. But every time we try to have this conversation, there is such a struggle with one's belief, particularly in the social work field, that fatherlessness has anything to do with anything except for a man not wanting to live up to his responsibility. From your space, why do you think this conversation is such a hard conversation to have?
Well, first of all, I have had your exact same experience. I've written on the social service, the nonprofit, massive social service sector in New York City, and I have raised the issue of family formation. And you're absolutely right. You get a deaf ear. People are just shocked. It's as if they've never heard such a thing. It's absolutely remarkable, the divide. This is simply not discussed in social work schools. The reason, one very powerful reason, I think, is feminism, which is one of the dominant ideologies in our culture, which is committed to the idea that so-called strong women can do it all. We see a major effort to devalue males in our culture. We're living through that right now with this moral panic over sexual harassment, some real, some imaginary. And there's just a desire to, I think, feminize the culture and argue that males are not important. Now, added to the very, very powerful wallop administered by feminism to the idea that we should recognize the massive importance, absent, strong reasons to the contrary, for a culture of marriage. It doesn't help now that we have this strong gay rights lobby. Now, I believe in respecting all people, and I don't think that people should be discriminated against because of their sexual preferences, but it is simply an empirical fact that when I go to college campuses and speak about the need for fathers and the need for a marriage culture that boys grow up in, I am inevitably accused of homophobia because I'm seen as not valuing that lesbian couple that is through artificial insemination is raising children. So it now becomes doubly politically incorrect to speak about the fact that on average males and females are different, mothers and fathers are different, each bring special qualities and strengths to child rearing that are complementary, and that just becomes something that may no longer be said.
Yeah, we do what I've realized is this is such a complex conversation to be having in such a selfish time. I think one of the biggest issues that we have today is that for many of us, it has become about us, and we don't have the level of compassion that it takes to understand another's point of view. We do a class called Standing in the Gap, Single Mothers Raising Boys. And there's two things that I talk to moms about when we do this class, because from my perspective, it's not only important that moms know what they know about raising children, but they also understand the importance of what dad brings to the floor on that. And so there's two things that I say to them. One is that you don't have the only perspective of being a single mom. I was a little boy who was raised up in a house with a single mom, and I saw things in my mom that she couldn't see in herself, and I saw it from the advantage point of being a little boy. And so I tell the story of how I listened to my mother being beat on the other side of the door by my stepfather and feeling helpless without the ability to do anything about that. That is a viewpoint and perspective of single motherhood that a mother can't bring to the table. The second thing I bring up to them is something that we must agree on in our workshops before we move forward, and it's a simple understanding. The simple understanding is this term single mom has become a power tool to devalue men, to position and to somewhat what I believe unfairly give a false sense of empowerment to moms. And I'm very literal in terminology in this way. And what I say to them is take this on just for a day and see how it fits. The term single mom does not denote parenting status. It denotes marital status. And so if you agree with that term does not mean parenting status, then you also have to agree with this term. For every single mom in this country, there's a single dad.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? And once you begin to start getting them to think differently about the terminology they use and the impact of the terminology that they use in where they believe they are becoming empowered by using it, they begin to get a sense on how that could be detrimental not only to their relationship with the fathers of their children, but to the children themselves. How do we begin to have a conversation where we can get sober-minded, logically minded individuals at the table to have a conversation that could get us to a place where we can actually move the needle in this space?
Oh man, well, you've been grappling with this on a full-time basis. That's the hardest question because, as you well know, and we've discussed this a little bit over the web before our conversation today, Mr. Braswell, this alarm about the breakdown of the family was sounded in 1965 by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who warned that the growing out-of-wedlock birth rate among blacks would serve as a check on further civil rights progress. Mm-hmm. And he's absolutely right. I mean, that is, I think, the fact that you have 73% of children now being born out of wedlock in the black community is the most important determinant of the high crime rates and the academic failure that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. Not again among everybody. There's kids that are doing great, that are succeeding, that are class valedictorians, but on average, it's not we're not talking about really wonderful achievements in social equality. But Daniel Patrick Moynihan back then, when the out-of-wedlock birth rate for blacks was only about 25%, mm-hmm. And he said that was a catastrophe. What would he have thought when it's now 3 times that? But he was immediately denounced as a racist. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because it's seen as somehow blaming the victim. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I mean, one thing one can point out is that the groups that are the most successful today, above all Asians, that are whooping everybody else's ass when it comes to academic achievement, achievement, that they have the lowest rate of out-of-wedlock child rearing, and the elites in this country, the white elites as well, are marrying. You know, they live a set of bourgeois values that talks about deferred gratification, that talks about deferring child rearing until you have a partner in mind that you want to settle down with and make a lifelong commitment to. They live those values, but they're not willing to preach them. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Occasionally we have the celebrities that speak out about this. Mm-hmm. Listening to those children who say, I needed a father, that would help. Mm-hmm. But the cultural forces on the other side that are trying to basically disappear males from our world are very, very powerful. Yeah. And seem to only be getting more so.
Yeah, you're listening to Dad's Pad Radio. I'm your host, Kenneth Braswell. My guest today, Heather McDonald, her new book, The War on Cops. And we're talking about the impact of fatherlessness on some of the social ills, or many of the social ills that we're dealing with today in our country, and how that has impacted and highlighted this issue of poverty, race, and gender. I want to kind of slide over a little bit and really get more specific to your book, The War on Cops, and this violence piece, because that is a whole nother conversation when it comes to the fatherlessness piece, and how do we govern ourselves in our community, and how do we be better parents at keeping our children at least out of the pathway of all kinds of violence. We're now in a societal bubble where this conversation of domestic violence and sexual assault, bullying, cyberbullying is at an all-time high. It just seems like people are finding any reason to oppress another person. And somehow, my wife and I was having this conversation last night, and I said to her, one of the biggest issues with the domestic violence conversation is a literal definition issue. And that is, when you say the terms domestic violence, automatically that means male violence against women. And so when you say that, you can't have a full conversation because people's definition of the term is very narrow. From your perspective in your book, when you wrote the book, what were you trying to get at? What were you trying to say?
Well, what I was trying to say in my book is that the crusade that we've been living through for the last 3 or 4 years, the Black Lives Matter narrative that says that we're living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings of black males, that narrative is both wrong and dangerous. It is simply not borne out by the statistics that black males are shot disproportionately when you could take their violent crime rates into account, because it's officers confronting violent, armed, and resisting suspects that is going to be the biggest determinant in officer own use of force. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, black violent crime rates are just massively higher than any other group in this country. Blacks commit homicide at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined, and 11 times the rate of whites alone. That results in blacks dying of homicide at 6 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. That is the civil rights violation that we should be concerned about. Mm-hmm. But as a result of this narrative that claims that policing is endemically racist, officers are backing off of the discretionary policing that they don't have to do, but that is pretty essential for bringing crime down. It's getting out of your car at 2 a.m. in the morning and asking questions of the guy hanging out on a known drug corner, hitching up his waistband as if he has a gun. The cops don't have to make that stop. Mm. They can drive on by and wait for the next robbery victim to call into 911 or the next shooting to be picked up by a shot spotter technology. Mm-hmm. And when cops back off of that type of proactive policing, crime goes through the roof in high crime areas. For the last 2 years, there's been a 20% increase in the nation's homicide rate. The victims have been overwhelmingly black. Mm-hmm. There's been an additional 1,800 black males who have been murdered over the last 2 years compared to 2014. Nobody seems to pay attention to that. Mm-hmm. I can tell you they're not being killed by the police. They're not being killed by whites. They're being killed by other blacks. Mm-hmm. So in this book, I try to give voice to the many, the thousands, if not millions, of law-abiding, good residents, hard-working residents of high-crime areas who support the police, who want more enforcement of low-level public order laws against loitering, hanging out in huge corners on the streets fighting, which is what happens with the youth in these high-crime areas, the drug dealing, the smoking weed in your one's lobby or corridor in your apartment building, and that the Black Lives Matter narrative has simply silenced those people and made their lives harder.
Yeah, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about the conversation that I'm living with respect to responsible fatherhood, your conversation now around policing and law enforcement in this society, and Michelle Alexander's book around the impact of mass incarceration. It just seems like that there's a theme that runs straight from my conversation through your conversation right into her conversation. And in this space right now of racial tension that we are experiencing around the country, that is so much politicized, do you believe that we can have a intelligent conversation around coming up with solutions to deal with this in this space?
Well, short of kids being raised by parents that are able to give them self-control so they don't pull out a gun if they're fighting over a girl, policing is the second best solution to bringing safety. I think it helps for all President Obama's strengths. It was not helpful that he gave a megaphone to the Black Lives Matter movement and validated it. For all President Trump's many faults and egregious character failings, it is helpful not to have somebody in the White House who is amplifying this phony idea that the criminal justice system is systemically racist. I take strong objection to Michelle Alexander's story, and it has been completely rebutted by two recent books by black academics, one by Michael Fortner, the other by James Foreman, who show that the increased drug enforcement happened at the behest of law-abiding black residents and their political leaders. So, I think it's important to change the public narrative and understanding about policing, and we're certainly better positioned to do so now than we were in the Obama years.
Yeah, when you, I'm interested in your comment to this, Heather. When you, based on what you just said, oftentimes when we hear these conversations, there is always a difference of opinion that is generated by a lens through which one is looking through. Which is the lens that you believe is creating the most uncommonality in terms of how we see these issues in our country? Is it race or politics?
Wow. Well, race has become politicized. I think, we have identity politics, which argues that these, I think, trivial aspects of the self, whether it's one's sex or one's gender, or rather one's race, are the most important aspect of the self. And people are wielding their race as a weapon of alleged victimhood to try and silence others. So I guess if forced to choose, I would say at this point in time, race and other identity aspects like sex are the driving force in our politics. And,
I'm listening to this and I'm like, wow, this is stimulating so many other conversations that I want to, some point I'm going to have to call you back on, Heather, where your time allows you to come back on to help me drill down. I love having conversations with folks who are thinking about this stuff intelligently, trying to strip apart all of the mess that's in the middle, pull apart the threads, and have honest conversation, because I believe that we don't have to agree. We can agree to disagree as long as we have the same goal in mind, and that is, what are we really trying to do? We're trying to create a world that our children are going to be successful in. They're going to live out their dreams. They're going to play out their destinies, and all of those kinds of things that we all as parents want for our children. But we kind of have to navigate this stuff in the middle in order to clear a pathway for them to do it. Heather, we're at our end of our time. Is there any lasting comments you want to give before we shut it down?
No, Mr. Braswell, I just congratulate you on your work and for keeping such a rational dialogue going about what I think both of us agree is the biggest, most tragic social problem of our time. And so I wish you an ever-growing audience to hear your important message.
Thank you so much. You're listening to Dad's Pad Radio on Blog Talk Radio. I'm your host, Kenneth Braswell. Today we spoke with Heather McDonald. She is the author of The War on Cops. You can find her at the City Journal, and I'm sure by Googling her all over the internet, I think that she is a woman of honor and someone who has a heart for this country and a heart for those of us who live in this country. And I think her voice is much, much worth being heard and should be heard. And we're going to do what we can do here in this space to give her voice a space to have this conversation amongst the diversity of conversations that are taking place in the world. Until next week, God bless and see you then. Take care.